Hey everybody, welcome to section 3 for chapter 19. And in this one, we're going to be talking about the impact the Industrial Revolution had on society. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about factories and inventions. Changes like the Industrial Revolution are called revolutions because they result in enormous changes throughout all levels of society. For example, it changed where people lived. Throughout all of human history before the Industrial Revolution, the majority of people in the world had lived in rural or country areas. Now you had a huge move to the cities. We call this growth of city populations urbanization. Now, urban means city, so urbanization is the growth of cities. Right now, a big reason for this was because of a population increase. You look at the overall population increase of Great Britain. Well, let me move me down here so you can see the last one. There we go. From 1500, where, and for this one, we are talking in the millions here, right? But you look at how much it goes up. 1700 to 1820. It more than doubles like that. And then, doesn't quite go up quite as much as this first one, but still, those 30 years between 1850 still goes up quite a lot. So we're talking a huge, huge increase from 1700 to 1820. And with this population increase, you're going to see changes in demographics. Also, something that we talked about in the first video, the enclosure movement. Remember we discussed back in the first video that it resulted in small farmers losing their land and moving to the cities looking for jobs. And that was a big one, right? People, from the dawn of time, people have been moving to cities because of jobs. The expansion of factories and the growing demand for industrial products meant more jobs were now available in the cities. These jobs didn't necessarily mean a nice lifestyle, though. And we'll talk about that in the next slide, titled The Working Class. Now, industrialization resulted in a large new social class known as industrial working class, different from the old peasant class, still poor and at the bottom, but very different in how they made their living. They typically lived in what we call tenements. Tenements are multi-story buildings divided into small apartments. Didn't mean to say that yet, but that's okay. And they had a very, very poor standard of living. You might have several families crammed into a very small area. Here's a typical row of tenement houses in an industrial city. You can just see how tight everything was. You got multi-stories, maybe about 4 or 5 right next to each other. You'd have an interior alleyway. You typically didn't even have alleyways in between each building. And that was just to let air out. It was also where people just tend to throw their garbage out. You didn't have running water. You didn't have sanitation systems. Garbage just rotted in the streets. Industrial sewage polluted the drinking water. These were not fun places to live. You see how tight and crammed they were. These tenements, they'd pop up right next to factories and mines and so forth. And they usually were owned by the factory and mine owners. And they were the only option that the workers had to live in. Now, because of these conditions, disease was very common. Disease like cholera, it happened all the time. Now, overall, life in the factories and mines, it was pretty miserable, as you can imagine. You had lousy working conditions. Workers worked long hours for very little pay. Right? You see the and notice also in this, women working in the factories. We'll keep these pictures in mind. We'll talk more about them later. But for now, just kind of focus on the conditions. You're doing, kind of a very, very mind-numbing work, over and over again, the same thing. Also fairly unsafe work. I'll talk more about that in a second. But this wasn't fun. This wasn't mentally stimulating. And you were doing it for long hours, 12 to 15 hours, for very little pay. Plus, these factories, as we just mentioned, they weren't safe. You didn't have anything like safety regulations back in the 1800s. No inspectors were coming through the factories to make sure people weren't getting injured or sick from machines or chemicals. And all of this was made worse by the fact that workers did not have job protection. Labor unions, right, like you see here, on strike for decent wages. They want a wage raise, living costs. Those were illegal during the early period of industrialization. Okay, there was no government protection for any of this. Sometimes workers would stage protests, but because they weren't supported by the governments, very little change could be implemented. And if you thought it was bad in the factories, the mines were worse. Industrialization increased the demand for coal and iron, so you needed more mines. And this is, even though it's a drawing, this literally is what happened. You had mine shafts that were not big enough for an adult to stand up in, and guys would just have to crawl up, and you had like this guy dragging this wagon full of coal or iron, whatever this, and these guys pushing it behind. And it was miserable. Conditions in the mine were even more unsafe in factories. These guys worked in darkness. They breathed in dust that destroyed their lungs, and they had to deal with flooded or collapsed mine tunnels. And also, to meet the need for more workers, it wasn't just men who were in the factories. You had women, you had children in here. Okay, this is this illustration I took directly from your textbook. You see, kind of women worked. They were actually preferred. I'm sorry, children were preferred in mine shafts because they were small. It was easier for them to kind of get in and out like that. Now, women. Think back to those pictures that I showed you a little while ago with all the women working in the factories. Women were often preferable to working in factories because you could pay them less. You could get away with it. So, textile factories of that nature, it was very common actually for the women to work in there because the owners didn't have to pay them as much. And it was a necessity for many women to work because the men weren't making enough. Remember, we said these were very, very low wages. So dad working by himself was not enough for these families to survive. They had to be able to work. Plus, children. I just said, children were small. They can fit into mines. They could also work machines. Imagine this by today's standards, with barefoot children climbing on top of heavy machinery like this. Even after child labor laws started to come in the early 1800s, they weren't really enforced. And, children, their size worked well for the factories as well. They had small hands. They could kind of fit inside and, fix things in there. So, what you see during this time is an awful lot of abuses of power of the upper class, of the owner class. Middle class worked out, they expanded, they did better, but the working class really it was rough for them. Women were working full-time jobs and had to take care of the kids at home. Kids as young as 6, 7 years of age were working full-time. It was necessary because the wages were so low and because you had no protection for their jobs. Now, since it started, there's been a lot of discussion about, was the Industrial Revolution a blessing or a curse? We started to produce tons of new stuff, but literally at the cost of workers' lives. People died in these mines. People died in these factories. And eventually conditions for workers did get better, but not before many men, women, and children had to undergo tremendous hardships in order to make all this stuff. So just a brief overview about what it was like working in industrial times and living in industrial times. And then we'll wrap things up with the next video, which will be the last one for the chapter, and talk about some new ways of thinking about society that emerged during the industrial period.